The first real tremor came like a whisper that turned into a shout. It was the kind of thing that small, contained lives weren't built for. A quiet knock at the wrong hour, a phone call that started with a breathy, "Are you sitting down?" and ended with a voice that had the steady, private cadence of someone whose world had just rearranged itself. Mark's wife, her name was Sophie, read my message. She called him that night. I imagined the conversation in a dozen ways: calm inquiry, angry accusation, whispered negotiation. I pictured 1,000 possible firmaments in which the little infidelity could be smoothed over, hidden, explained away. Instead, what I found myself imagining was the sound of a man's quick, surprised intake of breath as he realized the algebra of his life had been altered. Sophie confronted him the next morning. I did not see it, but word spread. People are bad at keeping their voices down when something private becomes urgent. The rumor, Mark's wife found out, arrived at the bar where my friends and I met that Friday like a small, sharp stone into a pond. Ripples everywhere. Mark's reaction was the worst kind of ordinary: defensive, then pleading, then the tired, practiced sorrow of somebody used to stepping back from a cliff and blustering his way out. It was a mistake, he told Sophie, apparently, in a tone that assumed mistake and apology were currency that could be exchanged for grace. Sophie did not accept it. She asked for proof. She wanted names, dates, times, the sort of specifics that could make honesty impossible to deny. I had given them to her. She took them and read them like someone examining a step that had collapsed underfoot. What followed felt, for a few days, like the slow, graceless death of a private life. Mark was suspended pending an investigation. The company put out a statement, neutral, perfunctory, about upholding professional conduct. They appointed someone to look into conflicts of interest and workplace relationships. HR, which had been my strategic lever from the start, did what corporate entities do. It removed people quietly from their routines and turned their lives into files. At work, Mark was careful, his public face shiny and pale as wax. At home, he fractured. Sophie filed for separation papers. The child, no one really knows how children fare in a storm until they are in the rain, was shuttled between grandparents and childcare. The family photos Mark had once posted with fond, flashy captions disappeared. A hole opened where they had been, and the world rearranged its furniture around the absence. And Claire, oh Claire, I had imagined her bewildered, defensive, angry, maybe contrite. I had imagined a brittle, swift downfall that would make everything feel balanced. Reality rarely fits the script our minds write for us. The first time I saw Claire after the storm began, it was at an art opening where a mutual friend had invited her. An ironic choice, perhaps, or a test. She looked smaller, not physically. She was the same woman who'd once seemed to hold whole rooms in her hands, but something inside her had shrunk. A softness replaced by a rawness, a line between her mouth that hadn't been there before. She did not accuse me, not at first. Instead, she sat across from me, hands folded, and for a long time said nothing. When she spoke, it was not the rehearsed apology I had expected. It was a confession, with the edges still damp. It was never supposed to be with him like that, she told me. It started as something stupid, something small. He made me sound alive when I was tired of being quiet. I don't know how I let it go so far. Her voice was brittle, broken on certain words. I listened and felt the familiar, disorienting blend of triumph and shame. The triumph was immediate. The plan I'd spent months assembling had worked in the crude arithmetic I'd intended. There were consequences now. They were not neat, but they were real. Sophie had been given truth. Mark had been put on a path where his choices would be interrogated. Claire's comfortable office hours and casual dinners had dissolved. And the shame crept in, slow and gathering. Watching her explain how it had started felt like watching a wound reopen. She wasn't just someone who had wronged me. She was, in that moment, a human being whose life had been rerouted, and the rerouting had my fingerprints all over it. People began to circle differently. Some friends, those who thought like I did about justice, clapped me on the back in private and said, "You did the right thing." Others, who had always valued quieter reconciliations, shut me out. One mutual friend, someone who'd introduced Claire and I at that first party years ago, refused to meet me for weeks. When we finally spoke, his eyes were not so much angry as wary, the way a person looks at a dog who has learned a dangerous trick. He said, "It's messy," the word cautionary. "You can win at mess, but you also live in it." His caution lodged in me like a splinter. The thing about revenge is that it does not stop with the target. It echoes. It refracts. The consequences radiate outward and land on people you never intended, friends, colleagues, even strangers who just happened to be in the wrong coffee shop at the wrong time. I had told myself I had limited the collateral. No illegal acts, no public spectacles. I had built a lattice of truth. But even truth can land like a wrecking ball in a life. Claire's career trembled. Her supervisor called her in to discuss professional boundaries. The same HR channels I'd nudged had done their bureaucratic work, and the rumors, like a slow mist, clouded the lunchroom. People who once sought her company now found excuses. Her confidence eroded. There was a softness in her smile that turned to glass when she laughed. At first, seeing these things made the inside of me purr. There was a justice to it, a straightness. What she had done could not remain private anymore. But then the days stretched longer, and the purr became a complicated animal. I found that when she texted, sometimes my thumb hovered over the message, and I would type nothing. I did not want to fix anything. I did not deserve to. But I also did not enjoy the sight of her unraveling like a seam. One evening, she sent me a photo, no words, of a little notebook with a single line underlined. "I am not a mistake." It was both accusation and plea. My hands went cold. In the months I'd poured into the plan, I had forgotten how complicated an ordinary human heart could be. You cannot cage grief or guilt into tidy categories. They leak out of every fold. Then there were the small, unanticipated retaliations from those I had put into motion. HR, when it performs investigations, seeks witnesses. They came to me for statements. Friends who had believed me were asked to corroborate stories. My own words, carefully chosen, formal, circulated in office spaces I never imagined. People began to look at me and tilt their heads trying to understand what led me to act like I did. I found myself defending choices I'd made in a tunnel where the light had been a single, focused purpose. And the strangest thing happened. Acquaintance with collateral conscience. A mother I barely knew sent me a message on social media, blunt and cool. You could have told her differently. I read the line and felt its small, precise judgment. She did not know my reasons. She only knew the fact of another human being's life collapsed. The message haunted me more than the friend's praise. Within the chaos, something else shifted. The person I had been became less interesting to my circle. Where earlier people had welcomed me as a man who'd loved and been hurt, now some viewed me as the man who had engineered ruin. There was a distance that no one apologized for directly. It was implicit. You can't make these choices and expect everyone to keep hugging you. There were also practical consequences. The mutual friends who had once been neutral began to avoid places where the triangulation of our lives would meet. Invitations dwindled. People are fragile social beings. We prefer to stand at the safe perimeter of someone's life rather than risk being brushed by scandal. My social calendar thinned like autumn leaves. And yet, this is the merciless knot of it. I could not say I regretted everything. I had not chosen malice from malice's sake. I had wanted a particular kind of rebalancing. But watching the human cost of that rebalancing pile up in front of me in the quiet collapse of a woman I had loved and in the icy withdrawal of people who used to be close, I felt a hollowness I had not predicted. The satisfaction I had imagined as a warm, victorious flame turned into something colder and more complicated. It warmed, but it also burned a little of my own skin. So I kept watching. I kept tallying the costs. And I kept listening to the dangerous little voice that said, there's still the next. I used to believe that love was the safest place in the world. That once you gave your heart to someone, they would hold it gently, protect it the way you protect something fragile and irreplaceable. That's what I thought with Claire. For 3 years, she was my entire world. We met at a friend's birthday party, a crowded apartment filled with cheap wine, laughter, and the kind of music people put on when they want to seem sophisticated. She was standing near the window, a glass in her hand, smiling politely at someone's joke. There was something about her, not flashy, not loud, but magnetic. When our eyes met, I felt a pull, as if the room had narrowed to just the two of us. From that night on, we were inseparable. Dinners at small restaurants, long walks through the city, whispered conversations until dawn. She had this way of making me feel like I was the only person who truly mattered. And for a long time, I believed she felt the same. I should have noticed the signs. The late replies to my messages, the sudden excuses about work, the way her phone was always turned face down on the table. But love blinds you. You convince yourself that nothing's wrong, that you're imagining things. That's what I did. Until the night, everything shattered. It was a Tuesday, ordinary, forgettable, except that Claire had texted me that she'd be working late. I decided to surprise her. I bought her favorite takeout, 2 cups of coffee, and drove to her office. The building was dark, except for the faint glow on the top floor. I remember smiling, thinking how happy she'd be to see me. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped into the hallway. Her door was ajar, light spilling out. I pushed it open without knocking. And there she was, not alone. My world froze in that instant. Claire was sitting on her desk, her blouse half open, her hands tangled in another man's hair. Their laughter, their kisses, the sound of it cracked something inside me that would never fully heal. She didn't even notice me at first. It was the man, tall, broad-shouldered, who looked up, startled. Claire turned, and when her eyes met mine, the color drained from her face. "Daniel," she started, but I didn't wait to hear the rest. I dropped the food, the coffee spilling across the carpet, and walked out. Her voice followed me, echoing down the hallway. "Wait, please, it's not what you think." But I knew exactly what it was. The days that followed were a blur. She called, she texted, she showed up at my apartment, crying, begging me to listen. I ignored her, shut the door in her face, blocked her number, but inside, I wasn't just broken, I was burning. Betrayal has a strange way of transforming grief into fire. At first, it crushes you. You can't eat, can't sleep, can't breathe without feeling the knife twist in your chest. But then slowly, the pain hardens into something else, something sharp. I replayed the scene in my head 1,000 times, each detail etched into me like acid. And with every replay, a thought grew stronger. She will regret this. It wasn't enough to leave her. It wasn't enough to move on. No, Claire had taken something from me: trust, innocence, the belief that love was safe. I wanted to take something from her in return. That was the night I began to plan. For the first few weeks after that night, my mind was a riot. Snatches of memory, half-breathed resentments, the hollow ache of betrayal. The initial shock had burned through me and left a colder flame that needed feeding. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the casualness of it, the ease with which Claire had torn up what we had as if it were nothing more than a sheet of paper. She had treated our life like a draft she could edit without telling me. That thought cut deeper than the image of them at the desk. When I finally let the idea of revenge come into the place where grief had sat, it felt less like a plan and more like an inevitability. I told myself over and over that this was about justice, about balance. I loved that version of the story, justice, because it kept me clean in my own head. But the truth was simpler and uglier. I wanted her to feel what I felt. I wanted the neat, precise hurt of knowing that she had lost everything she thought she could take for granted. There was something merciful about the way my fury focused. Before revenge, my emotions were diffuse and exhausting. Once the plan assembled itself, my life gained a shape. Focus steadied my hands. It gave rhythm to my days. I stopped replaying the scene as a film strip of humiliation and started cataloging details like a man preparing a list for a house move. Step 1 was gathering facts. Emotions were volatile and brittle. Facts were durable. If I did anything, I would do it on the foundation of incontrovertible truth. So I became, in a small and private way, an investigator. I watched them, at first in the obvious ways. Their public social media was small pictured theater. Their smiling coffee selfies, their staged weekend photos. But people leak more than they intend when they post casually. Mark's feed, the one he kept public, had a birthday he'd forgotten to untag himself from. The caption read something like family time, and there was a woman I didn't know, Mark's wife, in the background laughing like she thought the caption belonged to her. That one small detail cracked my breath out in a new way. Mark was married. He had a child, and Claire had been sleeping with him inside an office that belonged to both of them in a hidden life that would pulverize another family if exposed. The moral clarity of Mark is married gave me direction. Whatever I did next had to avoid the cheap theatrics of a spectacle and instead cut at the scaffolding of their comfortable life. I did not want to scream or throw things. I wanted to unsettle the foundations they stood on. I wanted consequences that would live long and quietly, ripples rather than explosions. I set rules. They were petty and exacting, like rules you invent for a sport you play alone. No illegal activity, no breaking into apartments, no hacking phones, no forging documents. I had friends who would have begged me to go farther. They liked the idea of a clean, cinematic revenge. But those people live for adrenaline, not for aftermaths. I wanted repercussions that were legitimate and defensible. Otherwise, I would become what I hated. No public spectacles. I didn't want a viral video where I screamed at her in an intersection. The world eats drama and moves on. I wanted something quieter that would gnaw. Evidence, not rumors. If I intended to reveal anything, I would reveal truth. Lies rebound. Truth pierces. With those roles, my plan took on the shape of a legal, procedural entanglement. Expose Mark's duplicity in venues that consequences would follow naturally. HR departments, the appropriate authorities at his workplace, even the person who had the right to know, in the most personal sense, his wife. If Mark's marriage collapsed, if his professional credibility evaporated, if Claire suddenly found herself alone and judged, then the scales would tip toward the balance I craved. But there was a bitter hesitation. What about Claire herself? She had been the center of my universe. Her life untangled meant my life could be exposed too. These were not abstract people. We had mutual acquaintances, the same social circles, the same favorite bar where my friends and hers had once toasted our anniversary. There was a social map to consider. I knew firsthand that when private pain becomes public currency, everyone around you is collateral. Still, that caution did not deter me. If anything, it made the plan finer. I would be surgical, not barbaric. I started small. I recreated the evidence the only way any scorned ex could, through patient observation. I knew the names of their favorite cafes, the times they lingered at the office late, the faces of their colleagues. I learned the structure of Mark's department, who reported to who handled HR complaints, and what the company policy said about relationships at work. It was a thrill, I'll admit, intellectually satisfying to trace a bureaucratic map. It calmed me more than any conversation with a friend could. At night, I read articles about workplace policy and privacy laws, not to learn how to break them, but to understand the channels that would cause the most damage. A formal complaint to his company's HR, evidence of the affair presented in a way the company could not ignore, and a private warning to his wife that she could verify before the rumor mill swallowed them. I wanted the consequences to be both swift and administratively undeniable. I crafted documents, lists and timelines, names and dates, notes that I left for no one but myself to remind me how the arc would run. These artifacts were not for show. They were blueprints. I dated them, corrected typos, added more detail until the edges were sharp. Planning gave me power. It gave me a sense of agency against the